The odds of survival were less than 10%. That was what the Navy brass told me when I proposed mounting a 75mm cannon on a PBY Catalina flying boat. They said the recoil alone would tear the aircraft apart mid-flight over enemy waters. The engineers calculated it would be like hitting the airframe with a sledgehammer every time we fired, and the Japanese destroyers would turn us into a fireball before we could get close enough to matter. But sometimes the craziest ideas are exactly what win wars, and I was about to prove them all wrong. What do you think happened when I ignored every expert and installed that suicide cannon anyway? It was July 1943 when I first arrived at Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay on the island of Oahu. My name is Gareth Pendleton, a lieutenant in the United States Navy with a reputation that had preceded me across the Pacific, though not for reasons that made me popular with command. Before Hawaii, I had been stationed in the Solomon Islands, where I had developed modifications for our PBY Catalina flying boats that increased their range but required removing some of the defensive armament. My commanding officer had rejected the modifications as too risky, but I tested them anyway during a routine patrol. When my plane returned with 20% more fuel than standard, despite flying the same distance, instead of recognition, I received a formal reprimand and a transfer to Hawaii, officially to serve as a technical advisor, but really to keep me away from aircraft. The morning after my arrival, I reported to Commander Wallace Thornfield, a career officer with a perfectly trimmed mustache and an expression that suggested he had just bitten into a lemon. The office walls were covered with maps of the Pacific Theater, red pins marking Japanese strongholds that were slowly being pushed back by the Allied advance. "Lieutenant Pendleton, reporting for duty." "Sir," I said, standing at attention. Thornfield finally raised his eyes to meet mine. "Ah, yes, the engineer who thinks orders are suggestions. Welcome to Kaneohe Bay, Lieutenant. I hope you understand that here we follow the chain of command." "Yes, sir," I replied, keeping my face neutral despite the immediate antagonism. "Good, because your record suggests otherwise. Your commanding officer in the Solomons was quite detailed about your, shall we say, independent initiatives. While I appreciate innovation, I do not appreciate officers who undermine authority. You are here to assist our maintenance crews with technical specifications, not to redesign our aircraft. Is that understood?" "Crystal clear, sir," I responded, though in my mind I was already examining the PBY Catalinas I had glimpsed on the tarmac during my arrival. They were workhorses, reliable but underpowered for offensive operations against Japanese vessels. Something about them had triggered an idea that had been growing since my time in the Solomons. For the first few weeks, I did exactly as instructed. But during off hours, I spent time in the base library, studying everything I could find about naval artillery and aircraft structural design. The PBY Catalina was primarily used for patrol and rescue missions, occasionally dropping small bombs or depth charges. But what if it could deliver a much more powerful punch, one that could actually threaten enemy surface vessels? The breakthrough came when I learned about a stockpile of 75mm cannon from decommissioned tanks that were sitting in a supply depot on the other side of the island. These M3 guns were powerful enough to penetrate the armor of most Japanese destroyers if you could get close enough, but too heavy for most aircraft to carry. Most aircraft, but maybe not the sturdy PBY Catalina, with its boat hull and substantial payload capacity. It was during the officers' mess one evening when I met Lieutenant Commander Marcus Holloway, a pilot who had survived 3 tours in the South Pacific and had developed a reputation for unorthodox tactics. Holloway had silver at his temples despite being only 35, and eyes that had seen too much combat. "So you're the troublemaker from the Solomons," Holloway said after introductions, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I heard about your fuel modifications. Quite clever, actually." "Thank you, sir," I replied, surprised by the compliment. Most officers had given me a wide berth since my arrival, but there was something I was hoping to work on that makes that modification look like a minor adjustment. Holloway leaned forward, interest piqued. "I've found that the best ideas in war often sound crazy at first mention. What are you thinking?" I glanced around to ensure no one was listening and opened my notebook to show him the preliminary sketches. "What if we mounted a 75mm gun M3 on a PBY Catalina? The M3 gun is the same cannon mounted on early M4 Shermans. With the right structural reinforcement, it could give us the firepower to actually threaten enemy destroyers rather than just spotting them." I expected laughter or dismissal, but Holloway studied the drawings with intense concentration. "This would change the center of gravity," he noted. "Handling would be affected." "Yes, sir. I replied. But with proper ballast placement and crew training, it could be manageable. The Catalina is slow with a cruise speed of just 125 miles per hour, but it's incredibly sturdy and could absorb the modifications if we reinforce these key structural points. Holloway looked up from the notebook. You realize Thornfield will never approve this. It's completely outside doctrine. I know, sir, I admitted. But our torpedo bombers are taking heavy losses, and the Japanese anti-aircraft defenses are getting better every month. They don't expect a patrol aircraft to be armed like this. The element of surprise alone could make it effective. Holloway closed the notebook and handed it back to me. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice. There's a PBY scheduled for a major overhaul next week. Hull number Charlie 7. It's got stress fractures in the port wing root that will take at least 2 weeks to repair. During that time, it will be in Hangar 3, which is used mostly for storage these days. The chief who oversees that hangar, Willard Peterson, served with me in the early days at Midway. He owes me a favor or two. My pulse quickened as I realized what Holloway was suggesting. But sir, if we go ahead without approval, Holloway cut me off. I didn't say anything about proceeding without authorization, Lieutenant. I'm simply sharing some information about our maintenance schedule. Thank you for the information, sir, I said carefully. It's always good to know the maintenance schedule. Holloway stood to leave, then paused. One more thing, Pendleton. Those 75mm guns from the tank depot, they're under Marine Corps jurisdiction. Navy requisition would raise flags. But I happen to know that Captain Reynolds of the 4th Marine Defense Battalion is an old friend of mine who appreciates creative solutions to difficult problems. You might want to pay him a visit. 2 days later, I found myself bumping along in a jeep toward the Marine Corps base where Captain Reynolds was stationed, my notebook of calculations and designs secure in my breast pocket. What I didn't know then was that Commander Thornfield had already been alerted to my unusual interest in heavy artillery and had assigned an intelligence officer to track my movements. The Marine base at Iwa was a dusty collection of Quonset huts and tents spread across the western side of Oahu. Captain Reynolds' office was little more than a wooden desk wedged into the corner of a supply building, surrounded by stacks of ammunition crates and maintenance manuals. Lieutenant Pendleton, Reynolds said, offering his hand. Holloway radioed ahead, said you had an interesting proposal involving some of my hardware. Yes, sir, I replied, taking a seat on an ammunition crate that served as a chair. I need a 75mm M3 gun, complete with mount and recoil system. Off the books. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed. The M3 is tank hardware. Mind telling me what a Navy man wants with an Army tank gun? I hesitated, but Holloway had vouched for him, and I needed allies. I opened my notebook and laid out my plans, explaining how the M3's ballistics and penetration capabilities could turn a PBY Catalina into an effective anti-shipping platform. Reynolds listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as I explained the reinforcement systems necessary to handle the recoil. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out a bottle of bourbon from his desk drawer and poured 2 fingers into a pair of tin cups. My brother was on the Arizona, Reynolds said, passing me a cup. Every damn day, I think about how I can make the Japanese pay for what they did at Pearl. But what you're proposing, he shook his head, it's either brilliant or suicidal. Maybe both. I need to know which one, sir, I said. Reynolds took a long pull from his cup. The paperwork says we have 4 M3 guns awaiting transport back to the mainland for refurbishment. But if one happened to get misdirected, well, paperwork gets lost in war. He fixed me with a hard stare. Just promise me one thing, Pendleton. If you manage to make this work, you take that gun and put it to good use. Make them pay. I will, sir, I promised, feeling the weight of his words. The gun will be on a truck to Hangar 3 tomorrow evening. I'll throw in some ammunition too, both AP and HE. A few dozen rounds, enough for testing at least. The truck will have a tarp over it, standard equipment transfer. My men know to keep quiet. My first recruit was Chief Petty Officer Willard Peterson, the hangar supervisor Holloway had mentioned. Peterson was a gruff, barrel-chested man with 20 years of naval service and hands permanently stained with engine grease. Commander Holloway says you're going to put a cannon on my bird, Peterson said without preamble, not looking up from the carburetor he was disassembling. If you help me, I replied. Peterson finally looked up, his weathered face impassive. The Catalina is a good girl, strong bones. But what you're talking about, putting that kind of stress on her frame, he shook his head. I need to see your reinforcement plans. I spread my notebook on the workbench, showing him the detailed drawings for the structural modifications. Peterson studied them with the careful eye of someone who had been keeping planes flying through 2 wars. "You'll need to reinforce the keel beam here. And here," he said, pointing. "And these struts will need to be doubled, at minimum. The recoil forces will tear her apart otherwise. Can you help me do that?" Peterson looked at me for a long moment. "I got 3 boys out there in the Pacific, 1 on a destroyer, 2 in the Marines. Anything that gives them an edge, I'm in. But I work on that plane in the open, official-like. What you do after hours with whatever crew you gather, that's your business. I don't see nothing. I don't hear nothing." In the next days, I recruited 3 more men: aviation machinist mate first class, Miguel Ruiz; a gunner who had survived a crash near Wake Island; aviation structural mechanic, second class Frank Nowak; a Polish-American whose family had been in Warsaw when Germany invaded; an aviation electrician's mate second class, Benjamin Cooper, a quiet genius with electrical systems who had been passed over for promotion twice due to his tendency to improvise solutions that weren't in the manual. The truck arrived from Iwa at dusk, just as Reynolds had promised. The M3 gun was wrapped in canvas, surrounded by crates of ammunition and spare parts. Peterson had arranged for Charlie 7 to be towed into the far corner of Hangar 3, behind stacks of spare wing assemblies and engine parts. For the next week, we worked through the night, sleeping in shifts during the day to maintain our regular duties. First, we had to strip out a section of the forward hull to create a mounting point for the gun. The M3 weighed over 800 pounds, and the recoil forces would be tremendous. We reinforced the keel with steel plates salvaged from damaged aircraft parts, creating a cradle that would distribute the force throughout the airframe rather than concentrating it at a single point. The breakthrough came on the 4th night when Ruiz proposed a hydraulic recoil absorption system adapted from landing gear components. It wasn't in my original design, but his experience with crash landings gave him insight into how to absorb sudden forces. By the end of the first week, we had mounted the gun in a fixed, forward-firing position, protruding from what had been the Catalina's bow compartment. The barrel extended just beyond the nose, with the breech accessible from inside the aircraft. We reinforced the cockpit with salvaged armor plating, providing at least some protection for the pilot and co-pilot. Our progress was remarkable, but it was not without close calls. Twice, surprise inspections nearly caught us, and we had to hastily cover our work with tarps and spare parts. The second time, Commander Thornfield himself led the inspection, paying particular attention to Hangar 3. The most nerve-wracking moment came when Lieutenant Junior Grade David Marshall, a new arrival assigned to aircraft maintenance oversight, walked into the hangar unexpectedly during one of our late-night sessions. We barely had time to throw a tarp over the gun before he rounded the stack of crates, serving as our privacy screen. "Lieutenant Pendleton," Marshall said, visibly surprised to find a senior officer in the hangar at 0200 hours. "May I ask what you're doing here, sir?" "Just checking on Charlie 7, I replied smoothly. "Some interesting stress patterns in the wing root fracture. Might have implications for other aircraft in the squadron." "At this hour, sir." "Couldn't sleep," I said with a shrug. "Figured I'd make use of the time." Marshall's eyes drifted to the tarp-covered section of the aircraft. I held my breath, watching his expression as he processed what he was seeing. There was a long, tense moment before he spoke again. "Mind if I take a look, sir? My specialty was structural engineering at Annapolis." My heart sank. I couldn't refuse without arousing even more suspicion, but letting him see our unauthorized modifications would surely end in a report to Thornfield. I was calculating how much of my career I could salvage when Ruiz accidentally knocked over a toolbox, sending wrenches clattering across the hangar floor. In the moment of distraction, Cooper whispered urgently in my ear, "Let him in, sir. I know Marshall from flight school. His brother was at Coral Sea." I made a split-second decision. "Certainly, Lieutenant," I said. "In fact, we could use another set of eyes." I pulled back the tarp, revealing the 75mm cannon and our reinforcement work. Marshall's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in understanding. He moved closer to examine the reinforcement struts we had installed. "The load distribution here is all wrong," he said finally, pointing to a junction where we had welded additional support. "You'll tear out this section on the first shot. You need to triangulate the force through these members instead." Marshall looked up at me, his expression deadly serious. "My brother was a gunner on the Lexington. He didn't make it. I want in." Just like that, our team gained a structural engineering expert, one whose insights would prove invaluable in the coming days. What I didn't know then was that among our growing team, Thornfield had placed an informant, someone reporting our every move back to command. After 10 days of furious work, Charlie 7 was beginning to look less like a standard PBY and more like something entirely new. The 75mm M3 cannon protruded from her nose like an accusatory finger, ready to deliver judgment to any Japanese vessel unlucky enough to cross her path. Marshall had completely redesigned our reinforcement system, incorporating triangulated struts that distributed the recoil forces throughout the airframe. We were making remarkable progress, but we still faced a critical challenge. We needed to verify that the aircraft could withstand the actual recoil of the cannon without tearing itself apart. Calculations and reinforcements were one thing, but until we fired that gun, while the Catalina was secured on the ground, we couldn't be certain our modifications would hold. Holloway arranged for us to use a remote section of the base for our test firing, an abandoned seaplane ramp on the far side of Kaneohe Bay, well away from the main facilities. We secured the Catalina to concrete moorings with heavy chains, positioned to absorb the recoil force when we fired. I insisted on being inside the aircraft during the test firing, despite Holloway and Peterson's objections. It was my project, my responsibility. Ruiz took position at the gun, while I stood behind him to observe the aircraft's structural response. Cooper and Nowak were stationed outside, watching for any signs of failure in the wings or hull. Marshall was at the cockpit controls, monitoring the instrument panel for any unusual readings. We started with a partial charge, loading the gun with a specially prepared round with reduced propellant that Reynolds had provided. Even so, my heart hammered in my chest as Ruiz chambered the round and took aim at a floating target we had anchored about 100 yards offshore. "Clear to fire," I called out, bracing myself against a bulkhead. "Firing," Ruiz responded. The sound was deafening inside the confined space of the aircraft, a thunderclap of noise that seemed to compress the air in my lungs. The Catalina shuddered violently, straining against her moorings, but holding together. Through the observation window, I saw the shell hit the water short of our target, sending up a satisfying geyser of spray. "Damage report," I shouted over the ringing in my ears. Marshall called back from the cockpit. Instrument panel shows stress, but within tolerance. No red lights. From outside, Cooper's voice crackled over our portable radio. Starboard wing flexed about 4 inches more than expected, but returned to position. No visible damage to struts or mounting points. We proceeded with increasingly powerful charges, carefully monitoring the aircraft after each shot. With the full power round, the recoil was impressive, rocking the entire aircraft despite its moorings, but our reinforcements held. By mid-morning, we had fired 10 rounds without any significant structural failure. The test was a resounding success, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe this crazy idea might actually work. We were congratulating ourselves, already making plans for an actual flight test, when the sound of approaching jeeps caught our attention. Commander Thornfield was leading a convoy of military police toward our position, his face set in a mask of cold fury. Someone had reported our unauthorized test firing, likely one of the regular patrols who'd spotted the PBY in an unusual position with obvious modifications. "Lieutenant Pendleton," Thornfield's voice was glacial. "What exactly do you think you're doing with this aircraft?" "Sir, I can explain," I began, but he cut me off with a sharp gesture. "Unauthorized modifications to naval property, misappropriation of ordnance, conducting unapproved weapons tests." He listed each offense like he was reading charges at a court-martial. Did I miss anything? Before I could respond, Holloway stepped forward, placing himself between me and Thornfield. "Actually, Commander, there are a few things you've missed. This is an approved experimental project." Thornfield's eyebrows shot up. "Approved by whom, exactly? Because I certainly didn't authorize it." "By Admiral Nimitz' office, sir," Holloway replied smoothly. "We're testing a new anti-shipping capability for patrol aircraft. The paperwork is probably still making its way through channels." It was a bold bluff, and I could see in Thornfield's narrowed eyes that he wasn't buying it. He was about to respond when a staff car pulled up, bearing the insignia of Rear Admiral Wilson, commander of patrol aircraft for the Central Pacific area. "Attention on deck," Thornfield barked, and we all snapped to attention as the Admiral approached. "At ease, gentlemen," Wilson said, his eyes fixed on the modified Catalina. "So this is what the Marines have been buzzing about, a PBY with a tank gun." He turned to me. "Lieutenant Pendleton, I presume." "Yes, sir," I replied, my throat suddenly dry. Wilson walked slowly around the aircraft, examining our modifications with a practiced eye. When he completed his circuit, he stopped in front of me again. Is it true what they say, that this was all your idea? It was, sir. But I had considerable help implementing it, and you've already test-fired it without tearing the aircraft apart. Wilson didn't phrase it as a question. Yes, sir. 10 rounds, including 3 with full powder charges. The modifications are holding well. The Admiral nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Thornfield. Commander, I received an interesting call from Captain Reynolds at Iwa this morning. Seems he was concerned that some promising weapons research might be shut down prematurely. He was quite persuasive about the potential value of this project. Thornfield's jaw tightened visibly. With all due respect, Admiral, this project was undertaken without proper authorization, using misappropriated equipment and personnel diverted from their assigned duties. Is that right? Wilson mused, turning back to me. No authorization at all, Lieutenant. I swallowed hard, knowing my next words could determine not just the fate of the project, but my entire career. No, sir. No official authorization. This was my initiative, based on combat experience in the Solomons. I take full responsibility. The Admiral was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, a slight smile creased his weathered face. You know what the Japanese call our PBYs, Lieutenant. Manatsu no Yo no Yume, the Midsummer Night's Dream. Because they appear from nowhere, strike, and vanish. He gestured at our modified aircraft. If this works, what would they call this nightmare, I wonder? Wilson turned to me. You have 48 hours, Lieutenant. Get this aircraft ready for a proper flight test. If it works, if you can demonstrate that this modification is viable and effective, I'll approve the project retroactively. If not, Thornfield here can have his pound of flesh. Are we clear? Yes, sir, I replied, hardly believing the reprieve we'd been granted. 48 hours, Wilson repeated, climbing back into his staff car. Make them count. As the Admiral's car pulled away, Thornfield fixed me with a cold stare. Don't think this is over, Lieutenant. When this fails, and it will fail, I'll see to it that you never set foot on a naval base again. Without waiting for a response, he stalked back to his jeep and departed, leaving us standing by our modified Catalina with a new deadline hanging over our heads. 48 hours, Holloway murmured beside me. Think we can do it? We have to, I replied. But we have a bigger problem now. We need to test this in flight, but we don't have any targets. Holloway's expression turned thoughtful. Actually, we might. Navy's running a gunnery exercise day after tomorrow, old destroyers towing target sleds. If we time it right, we could put that gun to a proper test. Hope surged through me at his words, but it was tempered by the knowledge that we still had significant work to do. The ground tests had been promising, but firing the cannon in flight would introduce a whole new set of variables. That evening, Cooper discovered that the ammunition Reynolds had provided had been tampered with, the powder charges subtly altered in a way that would cause misfires or potentially catastrophic barrel failures. Someone with expertise in ordnance had gotten to our ammunition supply. The sabotage was subtle but unmistakable, and it pointed to someone with both access and knowledge, someone working with Thornfield from within our own group. We had a traitor in our midst, and with less than 36 hours until our do-or-die demonstration, we had to identify them before they could do further damage. The discovery of sabotaged ammunition changed everything. We could no longer trust our own supplies, and worse, we couldn't be certain who among us might be working against the project. I called an immediate meeting in a secluded corner of the hangar, away from the aircraft, with only Holloway, Peterson, and Marshall present. We have a serious problem, I told them, keeping my voice low. Someone tampered with our ammunition, and it had to be someone with access and knowledge. That means one of our team is reporting to Thornfield and actively trying to sabotage our efforts. Holloway frowned. How bad is the sabotage? Cooper analyzed several rounds, I explained. The powder charges were altered to produce inconsistent pressures. Some would misfire entirely, others would generate dangerous overpressure. If we had used these in flight, best case scenario, the gun fails to fire when we need it. Worst case, it explodes and takes out the front of the aircraft. Peterson cursed under his breath. Do we know which rounds are compromised? That's just it, I replied. We have to assume all of them are. We need new ammunition, and we need it in the next 12 hours if we're going to meet the Admiral's deadline. Holloway was silent for a moment, then spoke decisively. I know another source. There's a Marine artillery unit running live fire exercises on the North Shore. I can get the ammunition, but it means leaving you short-handed for a few hours. Do it, I told him. But be careful. Whoever our saboteur is, they might try to follow you. Over the next few hours, I observed each member of our team closely as they worked. looking for any sign of unusual behavior. Nothing seemed out of place until I noticed Lieutenant Junior Grade David Simmons, an operations officer who had joined our project only 3 days ago, taking a particular interest in our fuel system. When I casually asked what he was doing, his explanation about checking fuel line pressure seemed reasonable on the surface, but didn't quite match standard protocol. By midnight, Holloway had returned with fresh ammunition, secured through his Marine contact. We carefully stored it under guard, with Cooper sleeping beside the crates to ensure no one could access them without our knowledge. Peterson had completed his inspection of the aircraft, finding several minor but potentially dangerous irregularities, including a loosened control cable and a fuel line that had been only partially connected. The flight test was scheduled for 1,400 hours, coinciding with the Navy's gunnery exercises 20 miles offshore. Holloway would pilot, with me operating the cannon from the bombardier's position. As the sun rose over the mountains to the east, I pulled Holloway aside for a final private conversation. "I think Simmons is our leak," I told him quietly. "Marshall caught him near the radio room last night, and he's been asking too many specific questions about our flight plan." Holloway nodded grimly. "I had the same feeling, but we can't leave him behind. That would tip our hand. Bring him along. Keep him where you can see him." At 1,300 hours, our team gathered for a final briefing before the flight. I laid out the plan in detail, while watching Simmons from the corner of my eye. His face betrayed nothing, as I explained that we would be conducting live fire tests against target sleds being towed behind Navy destroyers as part of the scheduled exercise. Just before we sealed the hatches, Admiral Wilson arrived unexpectedly, accompanied by Commander Thornfield. The Admiral looked grim but determined as he approached. "Lieutenant Pendleton, a word before you take off," he called. I climbed down from the aircraft to meet him, saluting sharply. "Yes, sir." Wilson glanced at Thornfield, then back to me. "Commander Thornfield has raised some additional concerns about this test. He believes the structural modifications may compromise the aircraft's integrity during normal flight operations, even without firing the cannon." "I understand his concerns, sir," I replied carefully, "but we've conducted extensive stress analyses and reinforced all critical points. The aircraft is airworthy." "I'm inclined to believe you," Wilson said. "But to address these concerns formally, Commander Thornfield will be accompanying you on this flight." My heart sank. Having Thornfield on board would complicate things enormously, especially with Simmons already posing a potential threat. But I could hardly refuse the Admiral's directive. "Of course, sir." "Well, make room." At precisely 1,400 hours, Holloway advanced the throttles, and Charlie 7 began to move down the seaplane ramp. The reinforced Catalina felt heavier than standard, but otherwise handled normally as we taxied into Kaneohe Bay. With our increased weight, the takeoff run was longer than usual, the twin engines straining to lift us clear of the water. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed we might not achieve sufficient speed, but then the hull broke free of the surface, and we were airborne. 20 miles offshore, the Pacific stretched in every direction, a vast blue canvas occasionally broken by the white wakes of naval vessels participating in the exercise. From our altitude, I could see 3 destroyers arranged in a loose formation, each towing a target sled about half a mile behind it. Holloway banked Charlie 7 gently, bringing us parallel to the exercise area while maintaining a respectful distance. We were cleared to approach the southernmost target from an eastern vector, maintaining minimum altitude of 1,000 feet until final approach. Holloway brought us down to 800 feet, reducing speed to 120 knots to provide the most stable firing platform possible. The aircraft bucked slightly in the thermal currents, rising from the warm Pacific, but steadied as we entered our final approach. "Ready on the gun," I reported over the intercom. "Clear to fire when ready," Holloway confirmed. I took a deep breath, centered the sight on the target, and squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding as the shell streaked toward the target. The recoil shook the aircraft violently, but the reinforced structure held firm, absorbing the force just as we had designed. Through the observation window, I watched as the shell splashed into the water about 50 yards short of the target. "Good effect," I called out. Adjusting elevation, I reloaded quickly, with Simmons handing me the next round. As I worked, I noticed him glance toward Thornfield again, a barely perceptible nod passing between them. Something was wrong, but I couldn't identify what they were planning. We came around for a second pass, and this time I adjusted my aim, compensating for the drop ID observed. Again, the cannon thundered, and this time the shell struck just meters from the target, sending a spray of water over the wooden platform. On target, I exulted. One more pass for a direct hit. As Holloway banked for our third approach, Simmons moved closer to me, ostensibly to hand me the next round. But instead of the high-explosive shell we'd been using, he presented me with a different round, one I didn't recognize. Special armor piercing, he explained smoothly. Captain Reynolds included it in the new shipment. Much more impressive demonstration than the HE rounds. I hesitated, suspicion flaring. This wasn't part of our plan, and I hadn't seen any such rounds in the ammunition Holloway had secured. I made a show of examining the round carefully, then rejected it. Well, stick with the ammunition we've already tested, I decided. This can wait for a future demonstration. As I reached for another standard HE round, a sudden lurch shook the aircraft. One of the engines sputtered, losing power momentarily before recovering. Holloway's voice came tense over the intercom. We're losing pressure in the starboard engine. Oil leak detected. Another act of sabotage, I realized. One that had been timed to coincide with our live fire demonstration. The engines had been fine during pre-flight checks, which meant the damage had been done after, possibly during our final preparations. Can we complete the test? I asked Holloway. One more pass, he replied grimly. Then we head back immediately. I nodded, loading another standard HE round as Holloway brought us around for a final approach. The starboard engine was running rough now, the aircraft slightly harder to control, but still manageable in Holloway's skilled hands. I sighted carefully, compensating for our slightly erratic flight path, and fired. The cannon roared once more, the shell streaking toward the target. This time our aim was true, the high-explosive round striking the wooden platform directly, obliterating the central section in a satisfying explosion of splinters and canvas. Direct hit, Cooper whooped over the intercom. Target destroyed. Even Thornfield looked momentarily impressed, though he quickly masked it with a scowl. That target was stationary and unmanned, he pointed out. A real destroyer would be maneuvering and firing back. Holloway didn't waste time on debate. We're returning to base, he announced, banking the aircraft toward Oahu. That starboard engine isn't going to last much longer. The flight back to Kaneohe Bay was tense, the starboard engine gradually losing more power. We were about 5 miles from the coast when our situation suddenly worsened dramatically. Fire, Cooper shouted, pointing toward the starboard engine, where flames had begun to lick around the cowling. Starboard engine fire. Holloway immediately activated the fire suppression system, which extinguished the worst of the flames, but the damage was done. The engine was now completely dead, trailing a thin stream of black smoke. We're going to have to ditch, Thornfield declared, a note of satisfaction barely concealed in his voice. The aircraft can't make it back on one engine with that cannon weighing it down. We're not ditching, Holloway countered firmly. We can make the coast. Barely. Then Cooper made a startling discovery as he inspected the dead engine. The fuel line has been cut, he reported, voice tight with anger. Clean cut, not a failure. Someone sabotaged it. All eyes turned to Simmons, who had gone pale. I don't, he stammered. I wasn't. Save it for the formal investigation, Lieutenant. I cut him off. The crisis had an unexpected effect on Thornfield, whose expression had shifted from satisfaction to genuine concern. Whatever his feelings about our project, deliberately endangering an aircraft and crew crossed a line he wasn't comfortable with. To my surprise, he moved forward to assist Holloway with the controls, lending his considerable flying experience to the task of keeping us airborne. Below us stretched a narrow strip of sand, thankfully empty of civilians in this remote section of the island. Holloway aimed for the center of the beach, bringing us in as slowly as he dared without stalling. The hull of the Catalina touched down on the sand with a jarring impact, the aircraft skidding forward as Holloway cut the remaining engine and applied what braking was possible. As we stood catching our breath, a convoy of jeeps appeared on a dirt road leading to the beach, Admiral Wilson in the lead vehicle. He had been monitoring our test from the command center and had dispatched the rescue party as soon as our engine trouble was reported. The Admiral surveyed our crashed aircraft, then turned to us with an unreadable expression. I see your demonstration included an unscheduled crash landing, Lieutenant Pendleton, he remarked dryly. Before I could respond, he continued, but my observers report 3 passes, 3 shots fired, 1 direct hit on the target. The weapon system functioned as intended. Yes, sir, I confirmed. The cannon performed exactly as designed. The crash was the result of sabotage, not a design flaw. So I gathered from your radio transmissions, Wilson nodded, his gaze shifting to Simmons. Lieutenant Simmons, you'll be accompanying the shore patrol back to base for questioning. Wilson turned back to me, his weathered face softening slightly. Your aircraft is damaged but salvageable. It'll have a recovery team. Bring it back to Kanohe Bay for repairs. In the meantime, he paused, studying me thoughtfully. I believe we've seen enough to justify proceeding with your project officially. Congratulations, Lieutenant. Your cannon-armed PBY is now a sanctioned naval experiment. 3 weeks after our crash landing on the beach, Charlie 7 was fully repaired and improved. With official sanction came resources we had only dreamed of before. Naval engineers and armament specialists who refined our makeshift modifications into something approaching proper military specifications. The reinforcement struts were now precision-manufactured components rather than salvaged parts. The firing mechanism had been redesigned for greater reliability, and the gun mount itself had been modified to allow for limited traverse, giving us a 15-degree firing arc rather than the fixed forward position of our original design. Most significantly, the ammunition had been upgraded. We now had access to specially modified shells with ballistic characteristics optimized for air-to-surface fire, developed by the Naval Ordnance Bureau based on our initial test results. Admiral Wilson had taken a personal interest in the project, assigning a liaison officer, Lieutenant Commander James Harrison, to ensure we received whatever support we needed. Our team had changed as well. Simmons had been court-martialed for sabotage and endangering a naval aircraft, receiving a dishonorable discharge and 5 years in a military prison. Thornfield had been reassigned to a desk job in San Diego, his career effectively over even without formal charges. After extensive ground testing of the upgraded system, we were cleared for a series of flight tests against more sophisticated targets, including a decommissioned patrol boat anchored specifically for our use in a remote area of the Hawaiian Islands. Over the course of 10 days, we conducted 15 sorties, firing a total of 37 rounds at various ranges and angles. The results exceeded even my optimistic projections, with 28 direct hits and the remainder close enough to cause significant damage to a real vessel through near misses. The morning after our final scheduled test, I was summoned to Admiral Wilson's office at Pearl Harbor. I found him studying a large operational map of the Central Pacific, red pins marking known Japanese positions, blue pins representing Allied forces. He acknowledged my salute with a nod and got straight to the point. We've received intelligence about a Japanese destroyer operating alone approximately 300 miles southwest of here, he said, tapping a point on the map well outside our normal patrol areas. It appears to be on a special mission, possibly delivering high-value personnel or intelligence to one of their forward bases. This represents an opportunity to test your cannon-armed PBY in actual combat conditions. My heart raced at his words. This was exactly what we'd been working toward, a chance to prove the weapon's effectiveness against a real enemy vessel. But a Japanese destroyer was a far more dangerous target than the practice sleds and decommissioned patrol boat we'd been firing at. What about escort, sir? I asked. Will we have fighter coverage? Wilson shook his head. Negative. The location is beyond the range of our land-based fighters, and we can't risk dispatching a carrier group for a single destroyer. Your PBY will operate independently, which is precisely why this mission is so well suited to test your concept. I understand, sir, I replied, mind already calculating the operational parameters, fuel requirements, ammunition load. You'll depart at 0500 tomorrow, Wilson continued. This is strictly voluntary, Lieutenant. The mission carries significant risk. If you prefer, I can assign another officer to command. I'll take the mission, sir, I said without hesitation. This was my project from the beginning. I should see it through. Wilson nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response. Very well. Select your crew carefully. You'll want your best people for this. The remainder of the day was a whirlwind of preparation. I chose Holloway as pilot, naturally, with Cooper as co-pilot and navigator. Ruiz would serve as gun operator, with Marshall handling radio and additional gunnery duties if needed. We loaded extra ammunition, checked and rechecked every system, and studied the latest intelligence on Japanese destroyer capabilities and tactics. By nightfall, Charlie 7 was fueled, armed, and ready for what would be her first true combat mission. We took off in darkness, the pre-dawn sky still speckled with stars as we headed southwest over the Pacific. The mood inside the aircraft was tense but focused, each man aware of the historical significance of what we were attempting. If successful, we would demonstrate a new capability that could change the balance of power in the Pacific, giving our patrol aircraft the ability to attack enemy vessels directly rather than merely reporting their positions for other forces to engage. The sun was climbing toward its zenith when Cooper, who had been monitoring the radar, reported a contact approximately 30 miles ahead. I moved to the observation blister, scanning the horizon with binoculars. After several minutes, I spotted it, a thin gray silhouette with a plume of smoke trailing behind it, unmistakably a warship moving at high speed. Japanese destroyer, confirmed, I reported. Looks like a Kajou class, one of their newest models. Holloway reduced our altitude to 2,000 feet, keeping us just below the cloud layer to minimize the chance of being spotted prematurely. We would make a single pass at high speed, fire as many rounds as possible, then climb back into the clouds before the destroyer's anti-aircraft batteries could find their range. As we closed to within 10 miles, however, our plan suddenly needed revision. The destroyer had altered course, moving directly beneath a large bank of clouds that would prevent our intended approach. We would have to either wait for it to emerge or attempt a different attack vector. New approach, Holloway decided after brief consultation. We'll come in from the east, out of the sun. It gives us less cloud cover for escape, but they'll have a harder time spotting us on approach. As Holloway brought us around to the new approach vector, I loaded the first shell, an armor-piercing round designed to penetrate the destroyer's hull at or near the waterline. The gun was already pre-sighted for the expected range and speed, requiring only minor adjustments during the final approach. 5 miles out, still no indication that we had been spotted. 3 miles, and the destroyer maintained its course, seemingly unaware of our approach. At 2 miles, disaster. A sudden gust of wind cleared a patch of haze that had been partially obscuring us, and lookouts on the destroyer spotted our approach. Alarm bells were clearly visible, ringing on the ship's deck as crew rushed to man the anti-aircraft guns. "They've spotted us," Marshall reported unnecessarily as the first tracer rounds began rising toward our position, still well off target but closing the gap. Holloway didn't flinch, maintaining our attack course despite the increasing danger. "We're committed," he said tersely. "Take the shot as soon as you're in range." At 1 mile, I had a clear sight picture, the destroyer growing larger in my improvised gun sight. The Japanese vessel had begun evasive maneuvers, turning hard to present a smaller profile to our approach, but it was too late to completely avoid our attack. I took a deep breath, centered the crosshairs just ahead of the vessel to account for its movement, and squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared, the shell streaking toward the target with a visible tracer. It struck the water just meters from the destroyer's bow, sending up a massive plume of spray that momentarily obscured our view. Ruiz was already loading the second round as anti-aircraft fire intensified around us, shell bursts blossoming uncomfortably close to our wings. I fired again as soon as the gun was reloaded, adjusting my aim slightly. This time, the shell struck home, hitting the destroyer amidships with a flash of impact that told me the armor-piercing round had found its target. There was no time to celebrate as Ruiz loaded a third round, his movements quick and precise despite the aircraft now bouncing in the turbulence created by near misses from the destroyer's guns. The third shot also hit, striking near the stern in what appeared to be an engine room or fuel storage area. A gout of flame erupted from the impact point, black smoke beginning to pour from the damaged section. The destroyer was hurt, but far from finished, its guns still tracking us with increasing accuracy as the gunners found our range. "One more pass," Holloway called over the intercom, banking sharply to bring us around for a second attack run. The destroyer was now fully alerted and defensive, making our approach far more dangerous, but the damage we had already inflicted had slowed it considerably, limiting its evasive options. As we came around for the second attack, disaster struck. A Japanese shell found its mark, exploding near our port wing and peppering the aircraft with shrapnel. Warning lights flashed on the instrument panel as the port engine began losing power, thick black smoke trailing behind. Worse, the impact had damaged our hydraulic system, making the aircraft increasingly difficult to control. "Port engine hit," Cooper reported, his voice remarkably calm given the circumstances. Hydraulic pressure dropping, ailerons sluggish on the left side. The Japanese destroyer, despite its damage, had effectively wounded us in return, turning what had been an attack run into a desperate struggle for survival. With our reduced speed and maneuverability, making another low pass would be suicidal. But retreating with our mission only partially accomplished wasn't an option I was willing to accept. "Can we maintain altitude?" I asked Holloway. "Barely," he replied, fighting the controls to keep us level. "But we're losing hydraulic pressure fast. In 5 minutes, we may not have functional control surfaces on the port side." A desperate plan formed in my mind, one that went against all conventional aerial attack doctrine, but might just work given our unique armament. "I climb. Take us up to 6,000 feet, directly above the destroyer." Holloway glanced back at me, understanding dawning in his eyes. It's never been tested at that angle. The ballistics are completely different. I know, I acknowledged, but they won't be expecting it. Their anti-aircraft guns can't elevate to hit us directly overhead, and their fire control systems aren't designed for that kind of defense. It was a massive gamble. Firing the cannon at such a steep downward angle would introduce variables we had never tested, from ballistic drop to the structural stress on our mounting system. But with our aircraft damaged and our conventional attack options limited, it represented our best chance of both completing the mission and surviving to return home. Holloway nodded once, then began climbing, taking us up and away from the destroyer's most effective anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese gunners, trained to defend against conventional air attacks, seemed momentarily confused by our retreat, their fire becoming sporadic as they lost a clear target. At 6,000 feet, Holloway brought us directly over the destroyer, which was now moving slowly in a large circle, black smoke still pouring from the damage we had inflicted on the first pass. From this height, it looked almost like a toy in a bathtub, but I knew it remained a deadly adversary, its guns still capable of bringing down our wounded aircraft if we gave them a clear shot. "Steady," Holloway called, fighting to hold our position despite the damaged hydraulics. One pass, directly overhead. I adjusted the gun to its maximum depression, a modification we had incorporated but never actually used in testing. Ruiz loaded a high-explosive round rather than armor-piercing, better suited for deck penetration from our steep angle. The math in my head was frantic, calculating drop and lead for a target nearly vertically below us, moving at approximately 15 knots. "Now," Holloway ordered as we passed directly over the destroyer. I fired, the cannon's recoil shaking the aircraft violently at this unusual angle. The shell dropped away, its trajectory difficult to follow from our position. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I'd missed entirely, then a brilliant flash erupted on the destroyer's deck, precisely amidships where I estimated the magazine would be located. The explosion that followed exceeded anything we could have anticipated. The high-explosive round must have found the destroyer's main ammunition storage, triggering a catastrophic secondary explosion that tore the vessel nearly in half. A massive fireball bloomed upward, the shock wave actually buffeting our aircraft despite our altitude. "Direct hit," Ruiz shouted, unable to contain his excitement. "We got her." For a moment, we all watched in stunned silence as the destroyer broke apart and began to sink, taking with it whatever special cargo or personnel it had been transporting. We had just demonstrated, in the most dramatic fashion possible, the lethal potential of a cannon-armed patrol aircraft against a capital ship. Our elation was short-lived, however, as Cooper reported that our hydraulic pressure had dropped to critical levels. The control surfaces on the port side were barely responding, and the damaged engine was losing power rapidly. We were over 300 miles from home with a severely damaged aircraft, facing the very real possibility that we might not make it back. Holloway's voice was grim as he assessed our situation. "We don't have the range to make it back to Oahu on one engine, not with the increased drag from the damage. We're going to have to find somewhere closer to set down." Marshall consulted his charts. Nearest friendly territory is Johnston Atoll, about 90 miles north. There's a small naval station there. Holloway nodded, already turning the struggling aircraft northward. "If we can make it there, we can get repairs and fuel for the return journey. Everyone's secure for an emergency landing. This isn't going to be pretty." As we limped toward Johnston Atoll, nursing our damaged aircraft through increasingly difficult handling, I had time to reflect on what we had accomplished. We had taken a crazy idea, a 75mm cannon mounted on a patrol aircraft, from concept to combat-proven weapon in less than 3 months. We had sunk a Japanese destroyer with direct fire from an aircraft type previously considered purely for reconnaissance and patrol duties. The strategic implications were enormous, potentially changing how naval warfare would be conducted in the Pacific theater. But none of that would matter if we couldn't get our damaged aircraft back to friendly territory to report our success. As the tiny speck of Johnston Atoll appeared on the horizon, barely visible in the late afternoon sun, the port engine finally failed completely, leaving us on a single engine with minimal hydraulic control and a very narrow margin for error in our approach. Holloway's face was a mask of concentration as he fought to keep the aircraft stable on final approach. "Prepare for a rough landing," he warned as the atoll grew larger in the windscreen. "If we miss the lagoon, this is going to be our last flight." The tension in the cabin was palpable as we descended toward the small patch of blue water that represented our only chance of survival. The Catalina shuddered and bucked in the crosswind, Holloway wrestling with the controls to maintain a semblance of a proper approach angle. The water was coming up fast, perhaps too fast, and I found myself gripping the nearest handhold with white knuckles as we made our final descent. The impact when it came was jarring but controlled, Holloway somehow managing to level us out just before we hit the water. We skipped once, twice across the surface of the lagoon before settling into a rough taxi toward the small pier visible on the atoll's main island. As we came to rest, the tension that had sustained us throughout the mission suddenly released, and I found myself laughing in relief, a reaction quickly echoed by the rest of the crew. We had done it. Against all odds, against expert opinion, against active sabotage, we had proven that a PBY Catalina armed with a 75mm cannon could not only fly and fight, but could sink a destroyer-class warship in direct combat. The air was thick with humidity as we gathered on the reviewing stand at Kaneohe Bay, 1 month after our return from Johnston Atoll. Charlie 7 gleamed in the morning sun, its battle damage repaired, the 75mm cannon prominently displayed in its nose like a badge of honor. The aircraft had been given a fresh coat of paint, and a new insignia decorated its hull, a cartoon cat holding a massive cannon with the words "Destroyer Killers" emblazoned below. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself stood at the podium, flanked by Admiral Wilson and a collection of naval brass that represented more stars than I had ever seen in one place. The assembled crowd included not only our original team, but representatives from naval aviation commands throughout the Pacific, sent to witness the official commissioning of what was now designated the PBY-5G, the G unofficially standing for gunship, though officially listed as a variant designation. Nimitz spoke with the calm authority that had guided the Pacific Fleet through its darkest days after Pearl Harbor. "Today marks the beginning of a new chapter in naval aviation," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled formation. When Lieutenant Pendleton first proposed mounting a 75mm cannon on a patrol aircraft, experts called it suicide. Technical analysis suggested it was impossible. Conventional wisdom deemed it tactically unsound. He paused, looking directly at me. "Sometimes, the experts are wrong." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Nimitz continued, "The successful engagement with a Japanese destroyer has proven not only the feasibility of the concept, but its strategic value. Our patrol aircraft are no longer limited to finding the enemy and reporting back. They can now strike directly, extending our offensive reach thousands of miles beyond our carrier groups. For this innovation, for this determination in the face of skepticism and active resistance, I am pleased to present Lieutenant Pendleton with the Silver Star." I stepped forward, overwhelmed by the moment, as Nimitz pinned the medal to my uniform. The citation was read, detailing our engagement with the Japanese destroyer and the extraordinary heroism displayed during the mission. It felt surreal, standing there being honored for what had begun, as a crazy idea born of frustration at watching helplessly as enemy ships operated beyond our reach. Following the ceremony, production of the PBY-5G variant was officially announced, with an initial order of 25 aircraft to be converted using the improved design specifications developed from our experience with Charlie 7. More significantly, the concept was being expanded to other patrol aircraft, including the newer PB-4Y Liberator and PBM Mariner. As the formal proceedings concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Holloway approached me with a broad smile. "Who would have thought that your crazy idea would lead to all this?" he said, gesturing toward the reviewing stand where Nimitz and his staff were still discussing the program. "Not Commander Thornfield, certainly," I replied with a wry smile. Holloway laughed. "I heard he's pushing papers in San Diego now, about as far from any innovative projects as the Navy could send him." Marshall joined us, now wearing the insignia of a full lieutenant, following his promotion for his role in the project. "The first training class starts next week," he informed us. 24 pilots and gun operators, learning everything we developed. "They want you to give the opening lecture, Pendleton." 6 months later, I stood on the deck of the USS Enterprise as part of a special briefing team, explaining the capabilities of the cannon-armed patrol aircraft to a group of carrier air group commanders. The PBY-5G program had expanded dramatically, with over 40 aircraft now equipped with the 75mm gun system, operating throughout the Pacific theater. More significantly, the concept had been adapted to other aircraft types, including the PB-4Y Liberator and specialized B-25 gunships used by the Army Air Forces. The success had earned me a promotion to lieutenant commander and a new assignment heading a special projects division tasked with developing innovative weapon systems for naval aviation. But more satisfying than the personal recognition was seeing the impact our work had made on the war effort. Japanese convoy losses had increased significantly, with cannon-armed patrol aircraft claiming 27 confirmed ship kills in the past 4 months alone, including 3 light cruisers and 11 destroyers. As I completed my presentation, one of the carrier air group commanders raised a question that caught me by surprise. "Commander Pendleton, given the success of your cannon project, what's your next crazy idea?" The room filled with laughter, but the question was asked seriously. Innovation had become increasingly valued as the war progressed, with commanders actively seeking new advantages against an enemy that fought with desperate determination as they were pushed back across the Pacific. I smiled, thinking of the new project already taking shape in our development hangar back at Kaneohe Bay. "Well, sir, I'm working on a proximity-fused air-to-surface rocket that can detect and home on ship engine noise. The experts say it's impossible, but I've heard that before." More laughter followed, but it was the laughter of recognition and respect rather than dismissal. The war had taught us all that sometimes the craziest ideas were exactly what was needed to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. The 75mm cannon that experts had called suicide had sunk a destroyer, changing the paradigm of naval aviation in the process. As I looked out over the vast expanse of the Pacific from the carrier's deck, I thought about how far we'd come since those first furtive calculations in a hidden notebook at Kaneohe Bay. The journey had been fraught with obstacles, from institutional resistance to active sabotage, from technical challenges to enemy fire. But through it all, a small team of determined innovators had persevered, turning what many considered an impossible idea into a combat-proven weapon system that was now changing the course of the war. Sometimes the experts are wrong, and sometimes the craziest ideas are exactly what win wars.